This is the historical region of Karelia. If it was its own country, we could estimate it to be about 215,000 square kilometers in size, which would make it the 85th largest country in the world, slightly larger than Guyana and Belarus, but smaller than Laos or Romania. The combined population of this area is over 1.3 million people, which puts it on par with Estonia. If this country did exist, it would probably speak Karelian, Finnish, and Russian, and its economy could potentially benefit from a strategic location between Russia and the European Union, which could facilitate trade and economic cooperation. Key industries would include timber, mining, and tourism, given the region's natural resources, scenery, and culture. In other words, if Karelia would pursue a policy of neutrality and non-alignment, it could be a relatively wealthy country, at least on par with any of the Baltic states, but even more so thanks to an abundance of resources. But of course, Karelia does not exist as a country. It may have had a chance, but the interests of its neighboring countries have often taken precedence over the desires of Karelian people for self-determination. Finland, for example, has historically sought to maintain close ties with Karelia, while also recognizing the region's ties to Russia, while Russia has sought to maintain control over the region, more or less as a buffer zone for St. Petersburg. As a result, the idea of a united or independent Karelia has remained largely unexplored. Karelian culture in Russia is mainly a folkloristic facade for the benefit of the tourist industry. The only permutation of the Karelian question which exists today is, should the lands confiscated from Finland by the Soviet Union be returned? And so far, the answer to this question has been a fairly determined no. Why is that? Why has it not been in the interests of anyone to reunite these lands? Let's roll. Karelia is and has been a complex entity that blends elements of Finnish and Russian culture. In the west, Karelians and their areas were considered Finnish, while in the east, they were perceived as Russian. Linguistically, Karelian is closely related to the Finnish dialects spoken in eastern Finland, and some Finnish linguists have even classified Karelian as a dialect of Finnish, though in the modern day, it is widely considered a separate language. Similarly, any remaining Karelians are considered to be closely related to Finns, or a related subgroup of them. During the late Middle Ages, the Swedish kingdom expanded its territory eastwards, taking control of the Finnish coast and going as far as establishing Viborg, bringing Catholic Christianity with it. At the same time, the Novgorod Republic took over most of the greater Karelia region, introducing Orthodox Christianity, thereby creating political, religious, and cultural differences. In the tumultuous aftermath of the Russian Revolution, as the old order crumbled and new possibilities arose, Karelia could have charted its own course as an independent state. However, fate had other plans. Finnish partisans, fueled by their desire to incorporate Karelia into the newly independent Finland, took control instead. Finland declared its independence on the 6th of December 1917, separated from the Russian Empire, which had held it as an autonomous Grand Duchy since 1809. It emerged as a relatively large country, spanning over 388 square kilometers, including not only its present-day territory, but also parts of Russia, including Karelia and the city of Petrozavodsk. Finland lost its Karelian lands to the Soviet Union during the Second World War after fighting two wars with them. First in 1939-1940, the Winter War, in which Finland defended itself against an unprovoked Soviet invasion, and secondly, between 1941 and 44, the Continuation War, where it failed to reconquer the lands it had lost and some more. In the peace treaty that ended the Continuation War, Finland was forced to cede these territories to the Soviet Union as reparations for the damage caused. The lost territories constituted about 10 to 15% of Finland's pre-war economy, and the population of these areas, which included both ethnic Finns and Karelians, was resettled in other parts of the Soviet Union, and some 420,000 Karelians and Finns were also resettled in Finland. The Soviet Union implemented strong measures of Russification in its new territories, including changing the names of various places and towns. The policies pursued were likely aimed at increasing cultural and linguistic barriers between Finland and the new territories. The vacuum of evacuated Karelians and Finns was filled by others moving into the area from various parts of the Soviet Union, especially from Belarus and Ukraine, as well as other regions which had suffered severely from the war. As a result, out of an overall population of some 500,000 in the Karelian Republic of today, only a rather small percentage of people have Karelian or Finnish descent. During the post-war period, the same areas near the Finnish border were designated as military buffer zones, and thus remained sparsely populated and heavily militarized. The border was meant to separate the two entities and draw a line between ideologically opposed social systems, and the former Finnish Karelia served more as an outpost against external threats rather than a real part of the Soviet Union, and as such remained relatively isolated. Within the Soviet Union, Karelia was sometimes referred to as the nearest Siberia to Moscow. Even though Finland had extensive trade with the neighboring regions, contact at its eastern border was limited, restricted to the purchase of timber for the pulp industry and the construction of various mining projects. However, during the years of perestroika and glasnost in the 1980s, there was an increase in official bilateral economic and cultural contacts, leading to the opening of Vyborg to tourism and visits to the countryside of the Karelian Republic. Plans emerged on the Soviet side for special economic zones, with the Vyborg region singled out as one of the candidates. However, implementation turned out to be problematic and time-consuming, with very little results. The ideas of more permeable borders were controversial on the Russian side, and it was difficult to agree upon a distribution of benefits between the local actors and the central authorities. At some point, the Karelian question could have been discussed, although the Soviets did not encourage discourse and refrained from raising the issue publicly, fearing that settling the Karelian issue would create a precedent with far-reaching consequences for its other republics. The disintegration of the Soviet Union brought the Karelian question back up to the agenda, at least in Finnish civic discussion. People wondered why, since there was no longer a conflict between opposing social systems and the border did not demarcate a profound difference between Western freedom and Eastern totalitarianism, why some rearrangement couldn't take place. The arguments were mainly raised by people belonging to the Karelian Association who had been evacuated from Karelia. Initially, support for redrawing the borders was considerable, with polls taken in 1991 showing that a third of all Finns supported negotiations with the Soviet Union. Advocates for the return of Karelia to Finland made their case on moral grounds, arguing that historical justice and cultural values demanded the reinstatement of pre-war borders. The issue gained attention in the press, in parliament, and through the Karelian Association, which represented the wishes of those who had immigrated to Finland. The chairman of the movement proposed a plan for an autonomous Finnish Karelia, similar to the Åland Islands. However, some opposed restitution, arguing that it could harm Finland's relationship with Russia, destabilize the European system, and bring up past injustices. Others pointed to economic, social, and military strategic problems. In particular, relinquishing the lands would leave St. Petersburg wide open, not something that the historically anxious Russian leadership could accept. Not to mention that Murmansk Oblast would also become vulnerable to being cut off. Militarily, Murmansk is one of the most important oblasts in Russia, with its stockpiles of nuclear weapons and access to Arctic seas. A large Russian minority would also end up having to integrate into Finnish system. And this problem would be significantly worsened by the fact that the region was known to have severe economic problems, created by the Soviet system. The Soviet Union, in its quest for progress, implemented a planned economy that aimed to establish industrial facilities in strategic locations across its vast landmass. These locations were chosen based on military, political, bureaucratic, and economic considerations, with the goal of maximizing regional specialization. The dominant enterprise in each location was not only responsible for production, but also for providing social services to the local population. The result of this planned economy was the emergence of hundreds of mono-towns, where the economy was overwhelmingly dominated by a single industry or company. These monotowns were often located in geographically inhospitable areas, chosen for their supposed rationality rather than their suitability for human settlement. They are entirely dependent on the competitiveness of a single company or factory, which makes their economies inflexible and vulnerable to market fluctuations based on Soviet-era economics and technologies, which can be outdated and ill-equipped to adapt to changing economic conditions. By the time the city-forming enterprises were privatized or liquidated in the 1990s, the workforce management system had already ceased to exist. As a result, the leftover workforce could not be easily transferred to other regions, as was done during the Soviet era, following the liquidation of no longer needed enterprises. Monotown residents also faced challenges in seeking employment elsewhere, as the state housing distribution system was no longer functioning, and the market value of their real estate was often low, economically constraining their options. According to a Russian government study conducted in 2000, there were 467 cities and 332 smaller towns in Russia which could be classified as monotowns. The combined population of these was 25 million, or a sixth of the country's total population. The footage on screen right now is not from Karelia, but from Siberia, far in Russia's east. It's called Kadykchan, a small town nestled in the harsh wilderness of the Magadan Oblast. It was once a bustling community. It was originally built by Gulag prisoners during World War II. Its purpose was to extract coal, and it later became home to miners working at two local coal mines that supplied power to the nearby power station. Life in Kadykchan was hard, but it was also normal in its own way. However, as the Soviet Union dissolved, coal mining industry in Kadykchan began to decline. The mines became unprofitable, and one was forced to close its doors in 1992. Then tragedy struck in 1996, when an explosion at the other mine resulted in the loss of 6 lives. The government made the difficult decision to close and provide subsidies to residents to move elsewhere. Major buildings, including the once thriving cinema, were set on fire. As of 2010, Kadykchan was officially declared completely depopulated, a ghost town frozen in time. According to the Financial Times report, Karelia has more monotowns than any other region in Russia. They also found that Karelia has had one of the highest unemployment rates over the last few decades. Although that problem has mostly been solved now with Ukrainian help. It's also worth to mention that Karelia has one of the lowest GDPs in Russia. There are of course large cities like Petrozavodsk and Vyborg, which aren't doing too badly and are managing to increase their populations and even modernize their infrastructure. But most of Karelia has seen massive depopulation, from 791,000 in 1989 to just 533,000 in 2021. That's close to a 39% decline. People have been doing their very best to leave. In other words, most of Karelia is a distant and militarized borderland, the economy of which ceased to function when the Iron Curtain fell, meaning its abandoned infrastructure is some of the roughest in the country, since the enterprises which were meant to take care of maintenance are either no longer there or are barely profitable. There isn't much anyone can do to salvage this mess in the short term. Integrating any Russian lands into a European country would take decades of heavy investment and would be of little economic value within our lifetime. Now, there was once a suggestion of incorporating Karelian lands into Finland using the same method which was used to incorporate the Åland Islands. A fascinating political compromise you must hear about. And this is my Patreon map. Anyone here has at some point contributed to this channel, and I'm most grateful to everyone who has done so. Thank you all. Geoperspective out.